Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode number 5 of the Granite Cornerstone entitled Halt, Who Goes There? Tonight's episode is going to be about the subject of guarding the West Gate. And before we start, I'd like to just share a couple of disclaimers that we would like to have shared with you this evening. First off, the opinions expressed here tonight do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Grand Lodge of New Hampshire or any of the Grand Lodge officers. The opinions that you hear tonight are just the opinions of the brethren who are speaking them and are not representative of the best or the only way to do things. So please take from this conversation just that. It is a conversation between three brothers about observations they've had over the years. Those three brothers will be myself, and joining me tonight, the Right Worshipful District Deputy Grand Master of the 2nd Masonic District, Right Worshipful Scot Newbury. Scott, welcome. How are you tonight?
Good. How are you doing, Tim?
And also joining us this evening will be the Right Worshipful Grand Lecturer of the Grand Lodge of New Hampshire, Right Worshipful Brother Christopher Busby. Chris, how are you doing tonight? Nope. Can't hear you, Chris.
Oh, I'm muted. Good, Tim. Let's try that.
All right. Perfect. So welcome, gentlemen. You heard my disclaimer, and I just want to make sure that we all understand what we're doing tonight. So what we are trying to accomplish tonight is to discuss the topic of guarding the West Gate, and that means a lot of different things. One of the things we're going to talk about is the perspective of the lodge towards its candidate, the perspective of the candidate towards its lodge, and the responsibilities of every individual in that process. This is going to kick off a 3-part series that really deals with the initiatic experience. We're starting tonight with that first knock on the door, where we discuss petitioning, voting, and all of those things that happen before a brother joins the lodge. Our next episode, we're going to be focusing on the mentoring experience and how to get a brother from his first knock to his Master Mason degree. And then in our 3rd episode, we're going to discuss retention and how to keep a brother engaged within the lodge. So let's kick off tonight's discussion. This is going to be a little different than our past episodes. It's not really going to be a question and answer interview style. It is going to be primarily just a conversation. We'll have some questions prepared and some topics that we kick in when the conversation is lulled. But let's start. So when it comes to guarding the West Gate, there's a lot of aspects to that conversation. And I think one of the things that we need to talk about first is identifying the ideal candidate. When you look at a brother who's petitioning a lodge, to you, what makes a good Mason?
From my perspective, Tim, one of the things that I tend to ask, and it's sort of one of those things that I thought myself when joining the fraternity, was the man has to be, in my view, a seeker, have to be looking for something greater. That can mean a lot of different things. That could mean spiritually, that could mean in the community. But that, I think, and oftentimes when we talk to prospective candidates for the fraternity, it can be very hard for them to identify what it is that they're actually searching for. And the nature of the fraternity, I think sometimes, it is this way for a reason. We don't give a whole lot of information up front. So it's sort of an interesting, journey that a person wants to start. And I say that in a larger sense outside of Masonically, that I think often sets people on a specific goal. And I feel as though personally that in that seeking comes that momentum and that drive in order to be able to not only want to change and to grow, but to learn more. So I think that that's an important aspect.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, Chris. I think one of the big things that you have to look at when someone says, "Hey, I'm interested," it's important to find out what they're interested in, as opposed to I'm looking for that just a place to go hang out for a couple hours every couple of days, or.
Right.
But it's important to find out what they actually are starting to look for. I mean, I hear a lot of times it's they want to get back to their communities. They want to talk with guys that are like-minded. So it's important to find out what they're actually looking for and make sure they're not looking for the wrong thing. I mean, I've talked to many individuals who ended up not becoming brothers because they went from the I'm interested to the I'm hoping to build a business. I'm looking for those business contacts. And when they realize that it's not really what we're here for, they kind of fade off into the woodwork. So,
and everyone joins the fraternity for a different reason. And I think we can all, we can look at the three of us as well as, those that are watching right now. And, it could be a drive toward connecting to history. That's a big one that I hear a lot. Being more active in their communities, seeking like-minded brothers. And so understanding and appreciating the different reasons why men come to us, to your point, Scott, I think is very important. But that I look at that sort of that seeking piece as that sort of that underlying sort of drive that covers a lot of these areas.
I think I'm inclined to agree. I think that there's an aspect of a good candidate, and I think we all know how to see them or spot them when we find them. But I think defining it's difficult, because this is a fraternity that has, for its rules of admission, very few rules. I mean, really, being a man, freeborn, in this jurisdiction, it's 18 or older, and you have to believe in a supreme being. And out of those, 4 rules, the only one that really changes between any of the jurisdictions that are recognized or regular is the age. But when you have an individual who meets those 4 criteria, sometimes you have to recognize that those individuals are not necessarily all going to make good Masons. And I think that identifying what aspect of their journey that they're looking to get, and to Scott's point, people join for a lot of different reasons, and some of them are not reasons that we should really be looking for brothers. Mercenary motives is one of those things that we say internally, and it's looking to build a book of business or something like that. And I think that finding somebody who has a desire and a drive to improve themselves in any way, and finding what that way is probably key to identifying what makes a good Mason.
Well, I think that's part of it. Then there's the other aspect to take a look at is those that are joining because they're looking for that connection piece. Now, in some cases, it's connection of like-minded men. It's a connection with individuals that want to do the same types of things. And in some cases, and I'm speaking only because I happen to be one of these types of that fall into the category, those that are looking to connect to their past. I have multiple generations in my family that were Masons, and that kind of gives you that underlying desire to be part of something and give you that connection level to, in my case, members of my family I never met, but I have that connection now because we were all Masons.
And that changes the dynamic, right? Because they already have a certain expectation, and obviously, your son recently, Alex, recently joined the fraternity, and he's lived with you his entire life, and so he's, even though he's not sat in lodge, he's been exposed to, sort of the culture of Freemasonry, in sort of a inundation over the course of years, and so you already have that. Some of that mindset already exists, whereas most of the men that we talk to now may have some of that connection, but most of the time it's they don't know anyone, and they're not necessarily connected.
I mean, from that perspective, I mean, I grew up with my father went through the officer chairs for his lodge, and you get to realize that certain nights, Dad's leaving, it must be rehearsal night, it must be lodge night. You have those types of things. The other aspect too is that you also have those that are coming from the youth organizations. I was a member of DMLA just like Alex was, and it's a situation where you get indoctrinated, I guess is one of the words you can use for it.
I mean,
you get used to it. It
is the definition of the word, right?
Well, I mean, you get used to it. I mean, think about it. The youth organizations, the young men and ladies of both DMLA, Rainbow, Job's Daughter, they all spend time together. They get used to that camaraderie, that brotherhood sense that they all feel. And then as they get older, they walk away from those youth organizations, and Masonry, and for the young ladies, Eastern Star is available to them. Here in the Northeast, it's there, and it gives them an opportunity to continue on those and expand it, and get a chance to meet people that they hadn't met before. I think that's probably one of the biggest benefits of the fraternity, is being able to meet so many different people from so many different walks of life.
Chris, you said something interesting about Alex, for example, is already exposed to the culture of Freemasonry. And to me, that's interesting because when I look at Freemasonry, I certainly see that we have similar attributes across all lodges. But I don't know that I would say Freemasonry as a whole has a defined culture. I think each lodge certainly has its own culture, and Freemasonry is, I think, what I would consider a thin veneer of culture of the whole organization.
Sure.
But do you think that makes a difference? The way a lodge operates, the culture of a lodge, obviously. I mean, I think it's a question that answers itself. Yes, I think the culture of a lodge greatly impacts a candidate's journey and decision. But how much does the culture of a lodge impact that decision compared to the larger culture of Freemasonry?
Going back to what you said initially about the culture, it does have a certain culture. I mean, there's certain, obviously base expectations that we all have for each other. We're all essentially, with obviously jurisdictional differences, doing the ritual, telling the story of Freemasonry, trying to impart our lessons, and we all do it in a relatively similar way. Whether that's culture or that's structure, I think that we may be splitting hairs, but I think that ultimately those two do end up bleeding or converging at multiple points. But as far as the lodge is concerned, I mean, and I would hope that this, and I know, in my heart that this is the case, is that every lodge has their own culture. And I think that it's important to explain to potential candidates what that culture is. And part of that is setting not only it, again, to use the indoctrination word, getting that man to understand sort of how my particular lodge, what we expect and how we do things and what our focuses are. Lodges have different focuses, and none of that's not a bad thing. That's a wonderful thing, is a diversity in Freemasonry. So explaining that to somebody that I think a lot of guys, when they talk to us, they're looking at Freemasonry as a very universal monolithic thing. And with the ancient, with our ancient charges and the fact that we all agree on certain things, does lend to that a little bit. But at the same time, we're all different just as much as every jurisdiction is different. It's important to be able to spend the time to be able to talk to that man about what that means, and maybe that a man isn't a fit for a particular lodge, which is a possibility because of what they're looking for versus what a particular lodge might offer.
Yeah, I think you and I have had that conversation in the past, and certainly you and I are both in different lodges, but we're in the same city,
Mm-hmm.
and many times we draw from a similar candidate pool.
Yeah.
And I would say our lodges certainly have distinct focuses and cultures, and I think that understanding that a candidate may not be a good fit for your lodge or every lodge is an important distinction in that process.
Yeah, and one of the things that when I personally talk to potential candidates for the craft, I say, we want you to be comfortable with us, and we want to be comfortable with you. We want each other to understand each other, at least, and have that connection to start with. But it has to be a mutual thing. So guarding the West Gate, actually, if you look at it from that perspective, is sort of the candidate has to do it for themselves a little bit as much as a lodge will have to do it. But it's important to have that communication and that time to bring somebody on board.
So let's say we've identified a good candidate for Freemasonry. We've gone so far as to identify a good candidate for our lodge. Scott's legacy example aside,
it doesn't mean as much. I'll be honest with you. Legacy has its place, but it only comes from the perspective of having members in your family being a member of the fraternity already, or having been a member of, in some cases, they haven't passed away, but I'll be honest with you, it's not always the case where a legacy item comes into play for other than the I'm trying to connect to my, my roots. Because most lodges, it's the same process you go through. I mean, just because you have the same last name as someone whose name's on the wall, doesn't mean it's a guarantee that you're going to become a member. And even if you petition, doesn't mean that you're actually going to make it through. So
I guess what I was trying to say is specifically your example, the example of you and your son in particular, because you both obviously had heavy exposure as a part of your familial legacy with Freemasonry.
Sure.
So the reason I want to put that aside for now is because let's just say it's a guy walking in off the street and he says, I'm interested. What's the first step? Because I know when I joined the fraternity, the first step was ultimately handing that guy a petition. And I think that the fraternity has changed in a lot of ways, and some lodges certainly have changed their methods. So what do you think that first step should be for a stranger walking in off the street?
Well, asking questions. I mean, letting that man talk, which I'll be honest, I'm personally not always very good at because I talk a lot.
No, don't say that, Chris.
Yeah, you're being real nice right now. We'll see what happens when the camera gets shut off. But I think that when you let you sort of seed that conversation, start to ask those questions, I think that a person's character comes out very quickly. But one of the things that I think that you have to do from the earliest moments is really set expectations. First to describe what you believe the nature of the fraternity is. And that's also, by the way, I'm going to sidetrack a little bit about that. I think that one of the things that tends to happen is that, and this is a good thing too, is that every brother has a different perspective on the fraternity. But I think that from an expectation standpoint, and this goes to lodge culture, is having the brethren sort of on that same page as to what those expectations are along the way, and what a candidate is going to have to go through. I think is crucial, and not only that, but seeing that man in different environments, I think is also very important, because we tend to. And my lodge does this, and this is a very common practice, right? You come to dinner, and you're in our house at that point, right? And so people behave a certain way. So seeing a man, I keep saying brothers, seeing a man in a social setting in his own home, I think is very important. Not even just in the context of the investigation itself, but even early, I think much earlier on in the process.
Yeah, getting the individual to start speaking is probably key. I know typically what happens a lot in our lodge when people walk through the door and they're interested, the goal we have at that point for most of us is to get them to sit down and just have the conversation. What is it? What brought you in the door tonight? Why tonight versus 6 months ago, a year ago, and try to have that conversation. And that's really key, because if you don't have that conversation, you can't really get an understanding. Is this an individual that you'd like to hang out with? That's kind of like one of my litmus tests. Would I be willing to sit with you and have a cup of coffee? Sure. And have a conversation. But I do think that, and to circle back to something you said, Chris, earlier, is the lodge has to have that conversation. Yeah. I mean, when you have a lodge with, I'm going to use a low number here because I'm going to go with the active membership, the guys you typically see around the lodge building doing stuff. You're 12 or 15 for usually at the top end, of the most active members, the guys that are there around the building all the time, the ones that will run into people who are stopping by. Mm-hmm. But those guys need to understand that and be all on the same page. And I think that's what gets missed sometimes, is I may have an understanding of what I think would make a good Mason fit for our culture at this particular lodge. But Chris, you might have a different understanding, and Tim might have a third. So we need to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I think it's important to have those conversations in-house before the next candidate walks through the door, or potential candidate.
And again, to be clear, we're not saying that, and I'm not saying that, there has to be uniformity in belief to a T, right? I think it just has to be sort of a general feeling of or a collective understanding of what it is that X Lodge is what is it that your lodge is looking for, and again, expectation I think is critical.
So there's a lot to unpack in what you two just said, and I want to touch on something Scott said first, and it's about your litmus test.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody that I want to spend time with, I want to hang out with, I want to have a cup of coffee with. To me, that's a huge factor in a lot of different aspects of the fraternity and the initiatic experience, because lodge for me is a place that I need to feel safe, and I need to feel comfortable, and I need to feel at home.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is the people, obviously, that I surround myself with. Having been in this fraternity now for over a decade and visited other lodges in the district, I feel a lot more comfortable in other lodges than I did 10 years ago. But no matter what, from the beginning, I've always felt comfortable in my home lodge. And I think that's a huge part of the conversation when you look at a candidate, is that the members of the lodge need to continue to feel safe and comfortable in their lodge building. And a candidate who disrupts that, or a potential candidate who can disrupt that, is something that needs to be looked at when you're looking at a candidate. It's not always just checking off all the boxes. There's those underlying sort of ephemeral things that you can't quantify, but certainly you can qualify as you're sitting there. And I think that's a really important point.
Well, yeah, and just to be clear on this, I mean, we're talking like it's a brand new brother coming in off the street. That litmus test, for me, that goes to brothers that are looking to join the lodge from another lodge. If they want to affiliate with our lodge, or they moved into the area, they're a brother already, but there's still that same thought process that has to go on. That same, is this individual a good fit for our lodge? Is it someone I could feel comfortable with? It's important to understand that, while we're talking about a brand new person coming in off the street, some of the stuff is applicable to when people are looking to affiliate from another lodge. So, it's a little easier. Yeah, not every Mason, is necessarily a good fit for every lodge.
Right, so. Exactly. I think that's a really good point.
And that in the West, the station in the West is the station of harmony, right? Well,
and I think that's overlooked a lot when you're talking about guarding the West Gate.
Right.
It's not just about making sure that the candidate fits. Making sure that the lodge will be harmonious for all reasons is an important role of that senior warden.
And that's true. That's true for any organization, but because of the nature of Freemasonry, I think it's triply true to use a Masonic number.
Well, yeah, because it's important to understand that you want to make sure that the individual's a good fit. You're all comfortable with them, because let's face it, sometimes, especially when you're having conversations with your brothers or in lodge, it can get uncomfortable if you're not familiar with the people that are in the room. Some conversations are difficult to have anyway. I mean, but if you're not comfortable enough to speak your mind in front of those that you're sitting there with, those conversations can't be had. So
I want to put a pin in this, because I think it's going to have relevance later on to some of the other conversations we have.
Yeah.
So the next thing that came up in the conversations we had was from Chris about setting expectations. Now, I've
said that a few times already.
You have. You know what I'm going to say next. Scott knows what I'm going to say next. And I can guarantee you, any Mason who's been a member of this fraternity for more than a decade knows what I'm going to say next.
Sure.
The expectation that a lot of us were given when we first knocked on the door of a lodge was one night a month.
Mm-hmm.
I think by now, you and I had this conversation just last week when we were prepping for this. Most lodges have generally done away with that statement, because if the experience of the three gentlemen here, and obviously it's Sunday night and there's 23 people, it looks like, watching this. Masonry is not one night a month. It can be, but the expectation, I think, is higher. So, Chris, when you say setting expectation, what do you mean? What is your expectation of a candidate, and what is your expectation once they're done their initiation period?
Well, everyone is different as far as the amount of time that they can put in the fraternity. I mean, us, we've got past masters and Grand Lodge officers here. We're, sort of the choir, right? We're the ones that, we're out a lot, and that's a choice that we've made. But I think setting the expectation is that, yeah, we want you to come to every meeting. We don't expect perfection, obviously, because that's not what this is about. You've got families and work and things that are important. We talk about them being important. They are important, and those things need to be addressed, especially when we're talking to new folks. But I think that you can set the expectation of these things come first, but also you're obligating yourself. You are joining a fraternity, and every member of that fraternity, every member of that lodge is important, and every member of that lodge is expected to contribute something, and that contribution is going to be varied and diverse and unique, and that's great. And we want to reinforce the fact that we want a new brother to bring their passion, their talents, their drive to be able to become better men, and to grow spiritually, to the table. And so, I think that there's a big difference between that and it's one night a month. And I think that answer is not the same thing for everyone, but I think we undersell ourselves fairly significantly when we say Freemasonry is only anything. So my view is that we have to sort of turn around a little bit about the way we talk about the fraternity, because we are expecting, this is the thing that we say a lot of times, you hear is good men and make them better. We don't take bad men and rehabilitate them. But we have an expectation, in that process at times can be very challenging, with the things that a man does need to do in order to become a full member of the craft of Master Mason. So I think being upfront and honest about that, and talking about your lodge in a way to where you express that meaning and that connection that you have with it, I think that translates. If it's the right man, I think that sort of connection and that sort of drive to want to participate is important. But then again, we have the other thing is we have to do the right things in order to be able to make sure that a man wants to participate going forward, which again, I don't want to steal the thunder from our coming conversations, but that is to be able to get a man excited about ways to be able to learn, grow, and contribute something.
Scott, what are your thoughts on expectations?
Well, I think a lot of it, first off, to the comment we keep talking about, it's only one night a month. I will be honest, I heard it myself. I never really truly believed it, having grown up around the fraternity, but I did have a very wise Mason once said to me that statement is only actually half the statement. And I think I've mentioned it to both of you before. The actual statement should be, it's only one night a month at home. Let's face it. I mean, it runs in cycles, though. I mean, I think that's an expectation that has to be set, is that there are some weeks where, you may only have one item on your calendar for masonry. Like, we've said, we're kind of the choir here. But, if, I only ever wanted to do my stated meeting, the actual business meeting, it's only one night a month. But most people want to put more into it. They want to get more out of it. And I think it's important to understand that when you set the expectation that it's more than just showing up to the business meeting, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to show up to every dinner, every meeting in the rest of the district, every meeting in the rest of the jurisdiction, that you're going to be on every Zoom call. It's important to understand that when we say the expectation is that you're going to spend more than one night, other than that one business meeting, that you're actually doing something Masonically related. It might be personal improvement. I mean, I've got a bookcase full of books behind me. There's podcasts to listen to. As long as you're taking that information and using it to apply to what you're trying to learn and how you're trying to grow, and then bring it back to conversations with the brothers that you regularly see, that's masonry every day of the year. It's not necessary. It's not putting the suit and tie on and sitting in a meeting. That's only one aspect of the fraternity. And I do think, setting those expectations up front is important. They need to understand that, there are certain things that if you move forward that you're going to be expected to do. And I don't think, unfortunately, you can do a quick Google search and find out everything you want to know about the fraternity out there. So, but I do, I try to make sure that once a person gets to the stage where I'm interested, what's my next step? Well, the next step would be to put the petition in your hand. Understand that once you do that, there's certain things that we're going to do as a lodge, and there are certain things that you need to do in response to that as a potential candidate.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because if we do say it's one night a month, and that one night a month is the business meeting, are we going to keep that man?
I know some that's good enough for them, but
and that's true. But I mean, these are questions. I'm not saying that you would or wouldn't, but these are questions to ask.
And one of the other things to take a look at too is that when you look at an individual, that might be what they can contribute now. It's hard to look into an individual and say, what are they going to be 20 years from now? The type of Mason I was when I joined the fraternity and the type of Mason I am now is two very different individuals.
Yeah, you join for one reason and stay for another, and that happens to all of us, I think, to a degree. By the way, Tim and Scott, I just got a message relative to this from some guy by the name of Ken Clay. I don't know who he is, but anyway,
sure he's not a troll.
But one of the things, for those that aren't in New Hampshire, he's our Grand Master. Hello, most worshipful. But he actually mentioned something that we were talking about in our other conversations, which is, before you join, visiting other lodges, seeing the various cultures. That's something that I very much, when I talk to folks, encourage. We have 2 lodges that meet in our building, in our town, both wonderful lodges. But again, going back to the idea that you're not going to, as a candidate, understand a lodge culture or the difference in lodge cultures if you don't get to experience any of that before you join. So I think that that's also very important as well, because meeting night, I don't think, is the only thing that that should be a determining factor, or geography for that matter.
No, I think that to that point, and I think that it's important for all Masons to travel, so that way when you're having the conversation with a potential candidate, have an informed decision, an informed conversation with that individual. You may come to me and talk to me, at my lodge, and I have that conversation with you. Say, I'm thinking to myself, I like this guy. He's a really nice guy, but I don't think he's going to be a fit here for whatever reason. He might be a better fit over Chris's lodge. But if I've never been to Chris's lodge, I don't know that.
That's a great point.
One of and that point in particular, Scott, is something that I don't think we see happen as much as we maybe should. When you have options, and not everywhere does, certainly. In the 2nd District, we're very fortunate to have a relatively dense number of lodges in one area, so you can refer people out. But when you have that opportunity to maybe recommend a lodge that's a better fit culturally, I'm not sure I've seen it very often happen in a conversation with a potential candidate, because a lot of lodges really do take a candidate, that candidate expresses an interest, and the lodge takes a claim. And for me, I think that's behavior that does a disservice to the lodge, because if you're not providing what this gentleman needs, he's going to leave. And if he's not interested, again, he's not going to be around. So I think that's a cultural issue in Freemasonry that needs to be addressed, is that sometimes it is okay to say no, but here's an alternative. And yeah, to your point, if you don't go out and visit those lodges,
Yeah.
you're in a rough spot and you can't make that determination, and you shouldn't. But to the Grand Master's point, telling a candidate to go visit other lodges is a huge cultural shift from what I've seen in masonry over the course of the last 10 plus years, because it's hard enough to get masons to go visit other lodges.
Just true. And it's hard. And you have lodges that, they want the opportunity to be able to scoop a man up that's interested. Believe me, I understand that. And so that's sort of the conundrum, right, of this, is that we have lodges, a lot of our lodges are in very rural areas in New Hampshire. So, when you have a guy that's coming to, Hiram Lodge in Newport, or Evening Star Lodge up north, there's not a whole lot else going on beyond, in 20, 30, 40 miles, 50 miles from a Masonic perspective. And you really want to be able to add that man to your lodge. And so that is an understandable place where that might be a blocker for some people in talking about other lodges in that way when they're coming to yours.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's, like I said, the second district is very fortunate in that from my house I can get to 6 or 7 lodges in half an hour. That's certainly not the case in some jurisdictions. And I think in those cases, obviously that decision is a little tougher. But, we've also had brethren on this podcast who travel 4 hours round trip to attend their lodge meetings.
Yeah.
So,
and by the way, I slightly misrepresented what the Grand Master said. So because I'm looking here and
we didn't send you a correction though. That's good.
Well, yes. He said to reinforce the fact that you're joining a lodge, but fully grow, you should be encouraged to visit other lodges to see the varying cultures. And we talked about that from the perspective of even beforehand. And again, that's it, one issue. And then the second issue is what you mentioned, Scott, is, you need to understand after you become a Mason, the broader culture of or the differences in culture that exist between lodges, so that you can become a more well-rounded brother yourself.
Well, yeah, and to go along with that, part of the reason for traveling isn't just that you could have that knowledge and that understanding that you can convey with another candidate, but you might actually find out yourself, hey, I really like the guys over here. I think I want to come over here, and you might actually decide that, you may want to make that shift yourself. But,
right.
You won't find those things out. And again, it goes back to setting the expectations. The expectation when you join the fraternity shouldn't be that you are a member of whatever lodge it is until the day you drop dead. That shouldn't be the expectation. The expectation should be that, you're going to grow as an individual, and part of that growth might be moving to a different lodge. I mean, I did it myself. I
Sure.
wasn't raised at St. Mark's. I moved to St. Mark's. So, it's one of those things that we have to take a look at, and the candidates have to be, made aware of the fact that that is their option. I mean, you don't have to join the first lodge that you walk through the doors of.
Sure.
So I guess one of the things that we need to talk about is a very important part of this whole process, and that's the petition itself. In New Hampshire, you require a signature from 2 brothers within the jurisdiction. They don't have to be members of the lodge you're petitioning. And what do we as a lodge, or we as individual brothers, have as responsibility when it comes to signing a petition, or even giving a brother a petition to seek admittance into our lodges?
I'll let Chris go first. He has very strong opinions on this.
He had to take a long because he's not going to stop.
I do have very strong opinions, but they're my own. And again, I'm not here to tell everyone how to do things. That's not it. Just, again, different perspectives. As far as that is concerned, I think one of the things that we get into a habit of, and I think we're all at one point or another guilty of this, is looking at the form and seeing the questions that are on the form, and then saying, okay, these are the questions that I have to ask.
Hold on, we haven't gotten to the investigation yet.
Well, but it is that petition process, right? But if you're talking about the investigation, I'm sorry, back up a little bit. So I'm confusing myself. Say
You
what
didn't
you were
even
saying
listen
again.
when I
No,
talked to him.
I did. I'm sorry. I just got too much sensory input. My apologies. One more
So the
time.
petition. What responsibility
No.
do we as brothers and we as a lodge have towards signing a petition, towards granting a petition, whatever the case may be, especially when you look at within the jurisdiction of New Hampshire, any brother within the jurisdiction can sign a petition for anyone in any lodge.
And so I'm looking at sort of the petition investigation together, but as far as accepting a petition is concerned, I personally believe giving more time before even being willing to sign a petition, because what are the duties of a person historically, sort of in Masonic culture. Generally speaking, the person that is a top line signer of a petition is really one that should be is A, vouching for that, the character of that individual, but B, is responsible for mentorship during that man's journey. So signing a petition should never be taken lightly for multiple reasons, one of which being obviously we want to make sure that this is the right fit for our lodge and for the fraternity, but secondly to make sure that there is that time to where you 100% as a signer of that petition feel comfortable. It almost needs to be, again, in my view, sort of by the time that you get to accepting a petition and investigating, we already know about this gentleman. The investigation is sort of tying up those loose ends, doing our constitutional duty, but we had already sort of loaded that time before accepting a position to really, truly get to know that person. Now, my lodge has done it a certain way, but I would say, I don't want to put a time around it, but what I would say is that the lodge brothers, the officers, should generally feel comfortable with the person that's petitioning, and understand that both the petitioner is ready to petition and that the lodge is ready to accept and move forward.
Scott?
I was waiting if you were gonna jump in there or not. It's the challenge there is that there's, and of course I've been in the fraternity longer than either of you gentlemen, and I actually, because of the break in my service, I've actually get to see firsthand the differences. I didn't
combined, by the way.
Yeah,
combined.
Well, I was thinking it, but I didn't want to say it. So thank you, Chris, for saying what we were all thinking.
Oh yeah. So just for the record, it's not that I'm significantly older than either one of you gentlemen. I joined at the tender age of 21, which at the time was at the young point that you could join with the fraternity in New Hampshire. But I actually saw what I'm seeing now, which is, there's a much larger emphasis on taking the time to get to know the individual before the petition even goes in their hand. However, I do recall a time in the not too distant past where it's like someone walked through the door, they mentioned that they were even interested, and the petition was in their hand with signatures on it.
Yeah.
So, I think they came pre-signed out of the secretary's desk in a lot of cases.
Yeah, they pretty much did. It's kind of interesting because you're kind of in a quandary here. And it's something that we really haven't touched on in our previous conversations dealing with petitions, is that when someone walks through the door of a lodge, you get to know them, have those conversations, you're comfortable with them, the lodge is comfortable with them, and every lodge, it's a different time period for each one. And in some cases, the lodges will take the fact that 2 or 3 brothers have sat with this individual over the course of the last couple of months, and they're saying, yeah, he's a good fit. And the lodge kind of accepts that, and then leaves it on to the investigation committee for the next, the due diligence portion. But, it's difficult because you sit there and you go, what makes the good individual? And then you take and look at, Chris, you just walked through the door of my lodge. You've got a signed petition in your hand. You're signed from 2 brothers from a different lodge.
Right. Yes.
And that's something that, we don't really run into that frequently here in New Hampshire, but it's a valid concern. I mean, what do you do when you have a petition that's got already 2 signatures on there. Obviously, you want to validate and make sure that both signers are members of a lodge in New Hampshire. But now, where do you go from there? Do you hold the petition up? He's ready to go. So
that, I guess that leads to the next conversation I wanted to have is, so say you've got a lodge, a brother who comes in, even if it's signed by 2 brothers from your lodge who may not be active members, 2 brothers who are certainly members and are known within your lodge.
That never happens.
Of course not. But they sign a petition for a guy who they know very well, who wants to join Masonry, but the active members, and this is not to disparage inactive members, obviously everybody does what they can. But if this gentleman is coming to join our fraternity and is not necessarily known by the people who are going to be with him throughout his entire initiatic experience, the people who are likely to be his mentors, and the people who are hopefully going to see this brother as he retains his membership and attends, what do you do with that? I mean, for me, I think that there's no easy answer. But we have a very multi-step process that I think is important to identify. And so we have a question in the audience from Right Worshipful Dave Collins, the Deputy Grand Master and Grand Master-elect. What do you feel is a good way to handle a prospect who comes in through a website request? Process signatures for petition. And I think this kind of falls under that same category. You've got a guy who's coming in off the streets. He's excited. He's got a signed petition. Where do you go with that? And my answer is you don't read the petition until the lodge is comfortable. I think there's a couple of different steps at which you can put a slowdown in the process, and I don't want to unnecessarily slow down the process, but I think to my comfort, if I were sitting in the East, I would probably have that gentleman either not read his petition, read it and assign it to an investigation and not hold a vote, because I think that the vote sets so much in stone, and the impetus that's on the brothers of a lodge to vote for the good of the order, we set a very high standard for accepting a petition and voting on it. But at the same time, if we don't know of a reason that this brother is not a good fit, we're encouraged not to vote in the negative on that petition. So where's the balance?
Yeah, and you're looking at sort of process for, except because the web is, that's where, here we are in the 21st century. That is where, a lot of our folks come from. As far as expressing interest, Facebook, websites, other social media. Our lodge is actually just putting together sort of a process to be able to communicate with men that email us, the types of brothers that he talks to, right? You talk to a past master of the lodge. You talk to a brother that's been a Mason only for a year, a guy that's a 60-year brother, and get those perspectives, I think is important as a part of the process. And I think, Tim, you mentioned something that was very important, is not to unnecessarily, we're not slowing it down just to slow it down, right? We're not trying to create a roadblock, even though it is meant to be, there are steps. It's not easy to join the fraternity, or it's not meant to be just, I want to join. Okay, join. There are these steps to go through, right? So
it's not a roadblock, but we want to check your ID at the gate.
Right. And very significantly, right? And I think, and again, because of what you mentioned before, Tim, that, you're coming into our home, our fraternal home, into the lodge, not necessarily the building, but the group of the lodge, the group of brothers. And I think it definitely behooves all of us, to for the future of our own lodges, not just for what we're experiencing now. We have to look at what happens to to us when we're gone. We have guys that are joining now that are 18, 19, 20 years old. They're going to be around far longer than we're going to be here. How are they going to contribute to the larger picture of what the lodge is?
Scott, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because we all talk about the different levels of comfort, and every lodge is different, every brother's different. I might say I'm comfortable with a petition that Chris comes to me and talks to me about because he knows the individual. I don't know him, but I know Chris. Do I trust Chris enough to say yes? I think he'd be a good fit. Not that I'm necessarily going to be a signature on the petition,
Right.
but that I think the end, based on what you're telling me, the person's a good fit. Those are things that have to be not only dealt with on an individual level, but on a lodge level. What's everybody's comfort level? And of course, as we're talking about, the vote seems to be the set it in stone kind of moment.
Right.
But I do want to back up to something that was mentioned earlier is the fact that, talk about slowing the process down. So often we get hung up on the constitutional items that say it takes this many days between each step. Those aren't set in stone either. Those are just guidelines. They're the minimum requirement. You've got to wait at least this long. Doesn't mean you can't wait 10 times that length if you want to. But I think it goes back to understanding that there's minimum statements that, minimum timeframes that we can look at, and we set that expectation with the individual. Hey, look, I understand you've got a petition. You've had 2 brothers sign it that you know real well. You'd like to join our lodge. That's great, fantastic. However, we'd like an opportunity to kind of chat with you and get to know you a little bit more before we move forward on the next couple of steps in the process. Can you come back at our dinner meeting, or come to Sunday night rehearsals, or whatever it is that so that you can meet a few of the brothers. Because that's one of the things that my lodge does. We set aside time before our rehearsal specifically for that reason, to get a chance to talk to people that might be interested in joining the fraternity, and with those that are in the middle of their process of joining. Since it's it's not an overnight sign, vote, done kind of thing. So.
Right.
I think we're definitely gonna touch on that constitutional minimum concept in our next episode when we talk about mentoring, because I know for me, my 3 degrees were scheduled pretty much the same night that my petition was voted on, and come hell or high water, I was going to be at those degrees, no matter what memorization I had done or was ready for. And
sure.
That's certainly a culture that I've seen change drastically over the course of the last 10 years.
But again, it goes back to setting those expectations. If someone is going to petition the fraternity, they need to understand that, yes, there's a petition process. There's the investigation process. Then we're going to vote on your petition. That's when the work starts.
And see, that I think is the question, is where in the process does the work start? Because you're right, the work for the candidate in their mind is going to start after they have to actually show up to a degree, do their memorization, return their ritual. But in my opinion, I think the work starts a lot earlier than that.
Well, from the lodge's perspective, I'll agree with you. From a candidate's, it depends on what you consider work. From a candidate's perspective, or a potential candidate's perspective, I'm looking at it from, I'd like to join your lodge. I can show up, I can meet the brothers, I can have those conversations. There's really no work or expectation set on me other than the show up. Can you be there? We'd like to talk to you. We'd like to get to know you. And if you can't make it, let us know you're not coming.
I get that. And I think that's, for me, part of the work is being present, making the time as a candidate, never mind an initiate, but making the time as a candidate to be at the places you need to be. And to Chris's much earlier point, it's not just the dinner meeting. Sometimes it has to be something else. And a lot of lodges may not have that opportunity to do that something else. But I think that it behooves us to find that opportunity.
I think one of the things that we tend to get bunched up on is patience, and not expecting that a candidate is going to have any. And guess what, guys? Patience as a Masonic is definitely talked about in our ritual. So I think that there is somewhat of a test there, right? When it comes to a potential candidate, is are they willing to sort of conform? Maybe might be too strong a word, but sort of follow what the lodge wants to do in the time that they want to do it.
You have to
as a part of that journey.
You have to stay within the guardrails, right? Is the journey that you're going to go on. You're going to go down this path. There's a set of guardrails that we're looking at maintaining, so that we can all go make sure we're walking in the same direction. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. We don't want everybody to be cookie cutter approach. I mean, let's face it, we're not going to walk out the other end the same way we all came in. It's important to understand that each individual's journey is different. But yes, patience is important. And I think that a lot of times when we look at the patience aspect, I don't necessarily think it's the candidate's patience that's being tested.
Yeah, it's ours.
The lodge's patience that's being tested.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to set better expectations for our petitioners, for sure.
See, now you guys are saying it all the time.
Yes, well, it's important, and I think it's an often, I don't want to say ignored, but often overlooked part of the process.
Yeah.
I was asked to be junior steward of my lodge. I was told that my responsibilities were bringing pie once every other meeting.
Oh, so back up for a second. Tim, when were you asked to be junior steward? How soon after you were?
8 months after I was raised.
I was asked the night I was raised.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's one of those things that, the lodges don't necessarily have the, patience that's needed.
But I was told, set expectations, two pies every other meeting. You got another guy who's going to do it every other meeting. You do it every other off meeting.
That is an expectation.
Somehow, 9 years later, I was wearing a top hat and holding a 197-year-old piece of paper that was now my responsibility. I don't know what happened in those intervening 9 years where I went from just being the guy with two pies to now being the guy sitting in the big chair.
You blinked.
You're right. And I think that's really, it's
humility. It's a test of humility.
But
I mean, the whole process is a test of humility.
Right. But we don't, in any aspect of Freemasonry, I think that the concept of setting expectations is there, but it's just the surface that we set. And then there's all of these layers underneath that I don't think we touch on appropriately in every interaction.
Well, I mean,
it's hard to.
It is.
I mean, there's just so much.
Right. And if you take a look at the process of a individual coming into the fraternity, and just to touch on what we've already talked about, there's so many levels of expectations for so many different individuals, and a lot of it gets missed. There's the expectation for the possible petitioner. We need to make sure we set expectations with them properly. The lodge brothers that may interact with a potential person coming through the door, expectations need to be set with them. The people who are signing the petition, what are those expectations? The investigation committee, what are those expectations? When you vote someone through or vote their petition down, and it does happen, what are those expectations and what's the impact of those things? So that's just from this simple little conversation. There's a whole handful of conversations that need to get had if you think about it.
And for many of those conversations, specifically the internal ones with the brethren who are already present, a lot of those conversations are more implied. And I think that it's very easy for a past master or a 20-year member to forget what it was like being a guy who's only been around for a year or two.
Yeah.
And when you assign that guy, that 1-year-old Mason, to an investigation committee, you assume he knows what he's doing. Very often he doesn't. And so you may not. No, go ahead.
To that point, just because you're a 20-year Mason doesn't mean you know what you're doing on an investigation committee either.
Also,
it could be your first one,
And usually the people who are assigning those investigations are going to be the master and the secretary. And those people tend to have more experience in the aspects of a lodge that are important here in this conversation. And unfortunately, you're right. When you do assign I've been on an investigation with a member of my lodge for an affiliation with a guy that I had never seen in the lodge building and still have never seen in lodge. And did he know? Did I know? Did either of us know what we were getting into? And I don't think we did. And I think, Chris, you made an interesting point when you talked about the online process and who a brother talks to. A recent past master of my lodge made a decision to assign investigation committees with, ideally a line officer, a past master, and a brother who has never served in an office, hopefully a relatively new brother. And I think that gives you a wealth of knowledge and experience that you may not have otherwise.
And perspectives. And that's really what, if I'm looking at it from a candidate's perspective, that they need to understand the perspectives of all of those men at different points in their Masonic career.
So say we've signed a petition or we've accepted a signed petition, it's been read, and we move to the investigation committee process. Okay. Now, Chris, under your ideal scenario that you posed earlier, the investigation committee is just tying up loose ends. And that's one part of it, but not all lodges necessarily have the extensive opportunity or necessarily the ability to meet a candidate extensively before his petition's accepted. So what is the role and responsibility of investigation committees? We all have gotten, for those of us who served on one, we get a form. It's got a couple of blocks for free text, but most of it is just a series of questions. And those questions are, in a lot of cases, the only ones that get asked. But they're not the only ones that need to be asked. What should investigation committees be doing with potential candidates? And what is their responsibility to the lodge? Chris?
Yep.
Oh, there he is.
It seemed like it was getting muted for me, so I apologize. But the investigation is sort of the final gate. It's the final check on the process. As far as the reports are concerned, right? You're right. It asks, and sometimes we might consider them in a modern time a little bit antiquated, right? Have you spoken to his neighbors? Well, are you going to go knocking on the petitioner's next door neighbor's door and say, "Hey, I want to talk to you about your neighbor"?
I don't speak to my own neighbor.
Half the time, they might not even know each other, right? So, what do you have to do in order to be able to know that other people like and respect the man that's petitioning us? I mean, social media is still a tool, right? And this is something that we've talked about before. And we don't do background checks officially as a part of the in the Grand Lodge of New Hampshire, but there are ways for us to be able to see sort of, I guess, for lack of a better term, how a man behaves in the wild, right? And I think that right, but you understand what I'm saying,
no, absolutely.
Just without eyes on him. So I think by the time that, in sort of my way of looking at this, by the time that you've gotten to that point, you have very few questions to ask. But again, those should be conversations. And one of the things that I did as master, and we still sort of do, is that we have, it goes back to the minimum requirements of the Grand Constitution. We have to have at least 2 brothers that have investigated a potential candidate, but we actually assign 4 a lot of the times because we want those additional perspectives. And you might have brothers, and you might, as a master, decide to select brothers that might not necessarily have had the level of interaction with the lodge as a larger whole, to be able to have an additional perspective after the time that the other brothers have been able to get to know that person. So, you might have a brother that's active but might not be at every meeting, understands the culture of lodge, yet might not necessarily know that person. And so we're adding that, sort of that final step to say, okay, everybody, is this, are we good? And I think that yeah, that's kind of my answer.
Well, I think it's important from the perspective of the investigation committee that those expectations are set well with them. They need to understand that when you go out and you're spending time with this individual to get to know them a little bit, if you haven't had an opportunity before that, it's not just filling out the paperwork for the investigation committee. Because your report, when it comes back, you're the voice that the other members in your lodge are going to listen to if they haven't had that chance yet.
Right. That's the bottom. That's the bottom line. That's the
if
end.
I'm sitting on the sidelines and I haven't had a chance to get to know Tim before we vote on him, I'm relying on Chris's investigation committee report to tell me, is he or is he not going to be a good fit for our lodge? Yes, I know who the petitioner is. I know who signed for him. I know the investigation committee reports. That's how I'm making my decision, because I may not have had that opportunity to actually sit down and talk to the individual. I'm relying on these other brothers, these 4 to 6 brothers, to make those decisions for me and let me know what's going on, and then I vote my conscience.
And so, one of the things is that the reports, and all lodges use something slightly different, but basically it's a form, right? I encourage a narrative. Like I want the investigation committee to write a little bit. It doesn't have to be a book, but just a few paragraphs to talk about your interaction with that man, because the information that by itself that's on that form is not a lot to really delve deeper into the character of that individual. So that's what one of the things that I encourage is really to tell a little bit more of a story, so that when you get to that to ballot on the candidate, you actually you have more than just to say, well, the person investigating, the brother investigating, marked yes for this particular man, and to be able to tell that, because to your point, Scott, without that, you're just reading the question saying, they're recommending a vote in the affirmative, and that's it, without sort of that additional discussion.
Yeah, I think it's also a piece that needs to be understood is that it's not just the individual petitioning at that point that you're there to speak with. This is the opportunity to get to know his significant other. Does he have kids? If so, here's an opportunity to get a chance to meet them. That's why it's encouraged to do these things in the individual's home and not in a sterile environment, like, I'll meet you for coffee at Dunkin' down the street from the lodge room, or swing by Sunday night or Thursday night and we'll do the investigation committee paperwork real quick. It's an important aspect of the process. I mean, if you really want to get to know an individual and understand who they are, get them in a comfortable environment with their kids, and you'll find out real quick the type of individual they are. How you handle your kids. Let's face it, 2 of the 3 of us are parents, and how we handle our kids is looked at by other parents.
I would have never been accepted. I would have never been accepted in the fraternity.
No, but I mean, I've seen guys that I think are great individuals. I think they make great Masons, and then I see them with their families, and it's like, this is like a Jekyll and Hyde situation. How'd this happen?
But their spouses and significant others also need to buy into this to exactly what you're saying. Like it can't. It isn't just the man joining the fraternity, right? The family, to some degree, is becoming a part of this. Hopefully, right? I mean, that's what we hope to do is integrate the family and make them feel comfortable and get them to know us too. Because if it's something that a spouse can support, then it's going to be an easier sort of process and transition for a man to start spending some of his time there, if his spouse knows that it's something worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, not everybody who joins, not all families who join the lodge need to be the Busbys. You know, where you've got.
Listen,
Listen,
Yeah.
I love the family. I
I'll-
think
no, but you're
to-
right. You're absolutely correct.
To be fair, though, Tim, the Busbys are what Masonry was at one point.
Oh, absolutely. And I
I
think
mean, when I went into the fraternity and when I was part of DMLA, it was the expected norm. If the gentleman joined the fraternity, his wife joined Eastern Star, the kids were all in the youth organizations. That's just what was done.
But don't confuse what I mean. I mean, whether or
Oh,
not
I know.
the wife and the
yeah.
kids want to get involved in the youth organizations and Eastern Star and things like that, that's really beyond the point. It's really
Right.
more of understanding what the fraternity is, get hopefully communicating its value and making those folks feel comfortable and integrated to whatever level that they want to be integrated.
Sure, but that's one of the things that needs to be understood is that because at one point that was what was considered supporting the husband
Sure.
in the fraternity.
Yep.
You joined everything.
Yep.
And we have a lot of brothers now whose wives support them by saying, why are you home tonight and not at the lodge?
Yeah, I mean, my wife married the senior warden of a lodge, really didn't have much to say in the matter at that point, but she supports me. She certainly shows up when it's appropriate, but she's not going to be joining Eastern Star, and that's okay too, as long as she supports me. And I think that's really important aspect of the family investigation. So the investigation committee is supremely responsible for communicating back to the lodge the opinion of those brothers who don't have the chance to have met the petitioner. I think that in the ideal world that, Chris discussed earlier, every active member, at least the guys who are showing up regularly, every one of them should have had an opportunity to meet this guy several times. But that's not always the case. So the investigation committee has to do it. They have to be the ones who speak on behalf of those brothers. And that's fine. That's their role and that's their responsibility. And as long as we set that expectation, we've done what we need to do.
Yeah, it's the communication of all of those things. That's
where we
so
need
critical.
to, I think, pick things up a little bit. But
just don't cross the T's and dot the I's and check the boxes.
The next and final step in this process, and we're going to be wrapping up on this, is the vote. Okay? You've got, say we're in the ideal scenario, everybody's met the guy, the loose ends have been tied up in the investigation, the vote goes off, white balls elect, he's good to go. Okay? What about those unideal scenarios? What do you do as the master of the lodge? What do you do as a member of the lodge who's casting a vote? And I think that's the distinction I want to find out here is if you're the master and you know that this individual has not been present enough or has not made an effort, but has the petitions, has the good investigation committee reports, but hasn't met most of the people in the room, do you bring that petition to a vote or do you say, great, we've got this information, let's take a step back and reevaluate should it have never gotten to that point? And as a member, say the master brings it up for a vote and you're a member who isn't confident that the investigation committee has met their responsibility and you don't see any reason that this candidate shouldn't be a Mason, but you also haven't had an opportunity to interact, or when you have interacted, it's not necessarily been to your satisfaction, but it's not strong enough to say he shouldn't be a Mason. What do you do as a member?
I think it's about talking and being willing to be candid and share it. You might not get as a member, right? You might not get a master to see your way. I mean, ultimately, it is the master's lodge, and he can proceed as he sees fit as long as all of the other aspects have moved forward. But if you were to go to a master as a brother, to say, look, I'm a little bit concerned. I don't think that happens anywhere near enough.
Well, I mean, the theme of this whole night has been communication.
Sure.
And that's going to be the theme of everything in this fraternity is communication. So I agree with you.
but beyond that, it's really the vote is sacred, and it's something that again, we should feel as though that we're comfortable, and if we're not, and I hope that masters would be open to accept that sort of feedback from a brother. And again, like I said, being a master in particular is a lesson in humility. Going up through the chairs, it's a lesson in humility, and being able as a master to be able to listen to the counsel of a brother to say, maybe we should slow this down. Now, those decisions may not be popular, and that in all cases, and that's something that you have to weigh as the master of a lodge. But I think that again, with that communication with your brethren, expectations set with everyone, it can be possible to be able to do that and have everyone say, you know what, okay, yep, he's right, let's slow it down. And the master has the ability to be able to control whether or not that happens. But it is ultimately up to him.
Well, and the other thing too is that it's important to, when you start to look at that, the master has to make sure that when the investigation committee happens, when the candidate's petition is signed, that the expectations are set with the candidate, that there is the possibility that this process could get slowed down at any given point. Because if the investigation committee has gone out and said, yep, you look good to us, the vote's going to be Tuesday night, and right after that they'll be calling you to schedule your first degree, they've already set the expectations with the candidate. And at that point, it makes it more difficult for the master to sit there and say, no, I think we need to push this off for another month.
And that's why the chain of communication, right? That's
yeah.
so important.
But I mean, it's important to understand that. And I think, we so often hear everybody that's, well, this is the next step. This is the next step. This is the next step. And this is when we're going to get there. So it's, the rush to get to the next step. I mean, let's face it, we've all seen brothers try to race through their degrees, and the ones that sometimes that race through their degrees and race into the appendant bodies, they're trying to get everything under the sun. It's like, you've got an entire lifetime to do all this stuff. So taking a couple extra weeks or an extra month here and there shouldn't be that big of an issue. But yeah, it's a lot of it comes down to that conversation, setting the expectations properly. Look, we've completed the investigation. We'll turn this in. At that point, it's going to be up to the master when they're going to bring your vote forward. At that point, they've set the expectation that, we're not the ones that are in charge. We're providing information back to the lodge so that they can make that decision. It's somebody else's ultimate decision to say, yes, we're going to vote on this petition tonight.
So I guess, the other part of that question is, at what point as a member is it appropriate to vote no? Is that discomfort an acceptable barrier? Is that the level that we want to set for voting no? If you think that this needs more time,
a podcast on its own, isn't it?
But it's something to ponder here.
Well, because you're right, Tim. I think one of the things that you have to take a look at is the discomfort level versus comfort level versus trust level that you have in your brothers. So we'll go back to this scenario we had before. When you're sitting there, I haven't had a chance to talk to Chris. I met him briefly. He was down here one evening. I got a chance to say hi to him on my way by because I had something else to do or he was leaving or whatever the reason is. So at least I know who he is. I've seen his face once. And now his petitions come up. It's been 3 months and his petitions coming before the lodge for a vote. Is it safe for me to say I don't think he'll make a good Mason because I haven't had more than that one short interaction with him, but yet I've got two signatures on his petition, both brothers I trust their judgment. I'll invite them into my house any given day of the week. The investigation committee has done their job, and it's, to Chris's point, it's not just a check the box thing. They've actually gone ahead and written a bit of a narrative so we have some idea who the individual is, and they're all in agreement. So am I okay to vote no because I haven't had a chance to do it? I don't know if that's necessarily the right way to go because, saying no to making an individual a candidate at that point just because I haven't had the time to spend with him, or the schedules haven't allowed for it, whatever it happens to be. Is that fair to the candidate, or am I putting myself ahead of the candidate, saying my needs are more important than yours?
Right, and that goes back to the purpose, Tim and Scott, what you said of the investigation committee. Right, is that the rest of the brothers that have not interacted with him have to know what this guy is all about, and I think as Masons we do have an obligation to trust our brothers. But then again, if there's something that you've personally witnessed, or something that outside of personal personal peaks and quarrels, right? There are constitutional methods, obviously, to go through for that as well. But I think ultimately it's got to be based on your conscience, but for the right reasons, right? To vote no, and that interpretation is very gray in a lot of areas. But I think that most knowledgeable brothers, I think, can look and be introspective on this and look at themselves and say, am I doing right by the fraternity by doing this? Do I trust the recommendations of my brothers? Did the process happen the way it was supposed to? You going to say
Finish your
something?
thought.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that last sentence you just said is key. Did the process happen the way it was supposed to? And I think I'm not going to speak for for you two and say, these are probably my wrap up comments here. Making sure that the process is happening correctly by communicating to everyone, the candidate, the members, the investigation committee, whoever it is at every step, and making sure the process is done correctly. Once you get those investigation committee reports back, make sure the master sees them and says, yes, these are fine. These are what we need. As long as you've done those steps, whether it meets, that ideal scenario that we talked about, or whether it meets the ideal scenario for your lodge and your culture, make sure that every brother is comfortable with what has been done, because then we should eliminate those questions. You should never have to ask whether I'm voting for the wrong reasons or not, right? We should know from the process and the thoroughness of that process exactly what we're voting on. And I think that's a failing that we see a lot today, is that we haven't set those expectations correctly. We haven't communicated to everyone where those expectations lie. And as a result, there are these gaps that leave a gray area that you're talking about, Chris.
Right.
And the more we talk about it, you're never going to get it exactly right.
No.
And that's the entirety of our journey, from that rough ashlar to the perfect. But the more we talk about it, the less gray area we have. And getting rid of as much gray area as possible, regardless of the process you use in your lodge, is the key to this whole thing, and making sure that you're doing right by the candidate.
And by the lodge and the fraternity.
And by the lodge, absolutely.
Right. And I think, Tim, that's where one of the critical pieces is doing right by the candidate. So often we talk about how we don't get along with people, or there's a challenge that someone has. You hear about all those little personal quirks. People, I could speak nicely to them, but I wouldn't want to go out and have a cup of coffee with them, and they're still brothers. So we've learned to set those things aside. It's important when we're looking at this entire process that you learn to set some of the things aside. Is that just a personality quirk with the individual? He drinks his coffee from his left hand, and I don't like lefty, so I'm not going to vote him in. It seems trivial, but there are people out there that make decisions based on those types of things. And we need to understand that, when we're talking to this individual, it's about setting the right expectations, communicating what we're looking for, and trying to find out what he's looking for to make sure we're all a good fit, and then working through the process and voting based on the facts and the information we have. Not because, hey, I got a beef with the master tonight, and I'm not going to let this guy go through because I know he signed his petition. and it's sad because I've heard stories of that stuff happening. Luckily, I've never seen it happen, but I've heard stories of, guys that, petition the lodge would make excellent masons, and then they don't get through because they're not voted through. And then there's the cooling off period. They have to repetition, they have to go through the whole process again. So, there are guys that won't go through it a second time. I mean, look at, the military. When you get kicked out of, special ops training, a lot of guys don't go back through, even though they have the opportunity to. It's not the same scale of things by any stretch, but there are people that, if you can make me go through it all again, I'm not going to bother.
It's a lot easier to wait a month in the process.
Absolutely.
And to say no, go through what must be an embarrassing situation and wait a forced 6 months.
Right.
And I think that's key, is that you lose a lot of good men if you don't make those right decisions.
And it's important to understand that 6 months here in New Hampshire
Right.
isn't to repetition your lodge, it's to repetition any lodge in the jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So it's a big thing. If you're not comfortable, when the master brings forward that item on the agenda that, we're going to vote on, Joe Smith's petition this evening, when he gets ready to bring that forward, if you've got some concerns, stand up and voice the concerns at that point. Don't wait for the vote. Because if it's something that someone can speak to and say, hey, look, I understand where you're coming from. This is what was going on. I had an opportunity to talk to him, and this is what was happening in his life, and that's why that stuff happened. And it may be, oh, okay, that's fine. And I got no issues at all. But if there's an issue, now the lodge has got a chance to address it prior to the vote and then get locked into what has to happen at that point.
Communicate early and communicate often.
So I don't know. It might be something that the communications committee believes in.
I would say ultimately, no matter what your process, whether you believe, or relate to the things that we've said tonight, whatever that is, I think, the time that we spend our lodges in this fraternity is worth it, and can only get better with our due diligence and extra care in the process.
Well, I want to thank you both for being here tonight and for joining me over the course of the next 2 episodes at least.
When is the next episode, Tim?
Well, thank you for asking, Scott. I really appreciate that. We will be back 1 month from today. February and March and non-leap years have those fun little situations where we'll be back in the 7th of March. We are planning moving forward. We've talked, the communication committee has discussed a schedule, and what we're looking at is doing this monthly on the first Sunday of every month. I say that, and I'm immediately going to lie to you. Come April, we are moving to the second Sunday, I believe. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, because of Easter Sunday.
So, brethren, we hope to see you back on March 7th. Our next episode is going to be, it's entitled "You Can't Go It Alone," and it's about the mentorship and the process of, once you've gone through everything we've discussed tonight, what's next after your first degree, and where do we go from there? So I think that's going to be a really interesting discussion, and I look forward to having you all there with us, and thank you for joining us tonight. And that's that. Good night, brethren. Scott, Chris, thanks again for being with us, and to our audience, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for hosting, Tim.
Good night, everybody.